And if not, then we'll just merchandise them all.
Okay, I think I'll start. Hello, everyone, both to you in the room and online. My name is Eva Kristin Pedersen. I am a Norwegian journalist, and I'll be the moderator today. First, I'll introduce the speakers that we have with us. Christina Skirka will have an address and introduce the topic on the agenda. Then there'll be a panel discussion. There'll be a very short time for questions, but if we do have time, we'll take some, and then some closing remarks, and that will be it. To introduce the speakers, I'll start with Christina Skirka. She is the CEO of Power for All, a leading global campaign with over 300 partners that works to hasten the end of energy poverty through boosting the adoption of decentralized renewable energy. Christina also serves on the technical advisory group for the SDG 7 for the UN. Then we have to the right, Dr. Ute Collier. She serves as the Deputy Director of Knowledge, Policy and Finance at IRENA, where she oversees its policy, markets, and finance related to the energy transition. And then to my right, there is Dr. Michela Morese. Dr. Morese serves as the energy team leader at FAO's Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment. She leads FAO's implementation of clean energy solutions for agri-food systems and sustainable bioenergy. Okay, I'll just hand the floor to Christina.
Thank you. There are some slides. How can we access those slides? Okay. While we're waiting for the slides, I just want to, first of all, really thank our partners, FAO and IRENA, for being part of this discussion today. A few years ago, there was a really excellent, very comprehensive piece of research put out by FAO and IRENA that really looked at how productive use of renewable energy can help transform how agriculture develops in a number of countries. And just to do a little level set, some definitions maybe to start. So when we talk about decentralized renewable energy, we also abbreviate that as DRE. And effectively, that means anything that's not part of a traditional centralized grid system. So it could be a rooftop solar system, it could be a mini grid, it could be a mobile solar farm. Every day there's more and more variations of that technology emerging. And that includes what's currently known as productive use of energy. So we also will abbreviate that as PUE or PURE, sometimes people call it. And that will get into some of the technology discussion with our partners on the panel today that really focuses on what are the applications of these technologies, whether it's a milling or water system that's powered by renewables, and its incredible potential to really transform agriculture, in particular in developing countries. There's quite an overlap actually between countries that have a problem with energy access and those that are also net importers of food and needing to look at issues of meeting population demands with increased productivity. So do we have access to those slides yet? Nope. Okay. Well, first of all, why don't we go ahead and get into our discussion a little bit more about Power for All. As mentioned, Power for All is a global campaign that's focused on accelerating the end of energy poverty with decentralized renewables. The focus on decentralized renewables is because of the very clear math that most of those without energy access are usually in peri-urban or rural areas. And so those are places that from just grid economics alone, it's quite hard to access. So with that, just a little bit more about why we do what we do and how we do it, but we're often referred to as a field catalyst. So we do try to bring together often disparate sectors to engage together to really plug in gaps that we see in the marketplace. And as we've worked more in renewables in developing countries, as well as agriculture, we've seen that this is a very obvious gap. Oftentimes oftentimes we'll see some working in silos where those who are responsible for agriculture often don't even talk to the people responsible for energy. So a lot of our work is focused on ending that bifurcation. And for anybody on the Power for All team who's listening right now, apparently there's a gap in slides. So if you might be able to forward your slides to FAO a second or third time, that'd be fantastic. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep ad-libbing. So first of all, we want to talk a little bit today about the fossil fuels in the food system. Unconditionally, we see time and time again that governments fail to really understand the footprint of fossil fuels in their systems. We want to talk about the climate cycle that unleashes, and then we'll get into the discussion about productive use and how that can really be that intervention that makes a huge difference. We've got both of my colleagues here, Uta and Maria, to talk a little bit about policy as well as technology. So that should be an enjoyable part of the discussion. But first, let's talk about what is a food system. So it's really easy to think about food as just being what you get from your grocery store or your local farmer's market. But in fact, what we have today is an incredibly complex global food system, which involves many large corporate entities. It often involves moving food across borders to move it back and get people fed. But it's certainly not probably what we even would have recognized 100 years ago. Today, the global food system is worth, depending on the estimates you look at, somewhere between $8 trillion and $10 trillion. So you could imagine with those kinds of numbers and basically a small group of countries and companies who are in controlling interests of most of those resources, that we have a pretty unjust situation in some cases, but certainly unbalanced. And as we've seen recently, even just a slight change in fuel prices or an intervention like we're seeing with the invasion of the Ukraine really can create massive ripple effects for people, thousands of miles away. The food system itself is responsible for about a third of all GHG emissions. And that's something, again, most people don't necessarily realize. And in addition to that, the food systems generally are responsible for about 30% of energy consumed today. And I think the startling fact, and one of the reasons we're here today to speak, is that out of that 30%, the vast majority of fossil fuels, and an estimated 80% of the fuels powering our food systems all along that value chain are fossil fuels. So it creates a sort of compounding effect when you look at how that choice to continue to fuel our food systems with fossil fuels makes a pretty dramatic situation. So what we have is a modern system as a result that's anything but resilient. And at the same time, we are producing more food than at any time in human history. We also have more hunger and more people facing food insecurity. When we look at the causes, the way the modern food system challenges the climate, it includes everything from deforestation and soil degradation to industrial processing, transport and refrigeration, and of course, food waste, which is also a major source of these emissions. But then we end up in this cycle where at the same time we have this effect, we're also seeing how every time we try to farm or engage in agriculture, it further challenges the global food system, creating in our climate changed world more extreme temperatures like we're experiencing today in Rome, drought and water quality issues, and unpredictable weather. So it makes it very hard for all kinds of farmers. But when you question how we got here, there's been a general push to try to industrialize, concentrate, and mechanize food systems, which, of course, in many ways, when we're facing food scarcity, that's an important topic. But what if there was a way to challenge the way that we do business as usual in agriculture by interjecting renewable energy? Fantastic. It looks like we have some slides. If you could forward, thank you. We are, in fact, that's great. And now I have a blinker. So with climate change today, what we are seeing are these twin challenges where we desperately need to anticipate how we're going to feed this 60% increase in food demand by 2050. But on that exact same trajectory is the desperate need to not go over a 1.5 degree increase, so we avoid a climate catastrophe. So these effects of climate change, this sort of vicious cycle that we see, is self-reinforcing because we're sticking to business as usual practices for the majority of how we fuel the food system. So part of this panel is to look at how do we intervene? How do we change that cycle? And it's really important, especially from a perspective of food security and equitable outcomes across the world. So what we have now is a system where countries who are most vulnerable to climate are also the least responsible. And we're in a situation with a deep dive on Africa, which I think we'll focus on for the next few minutes because it's very illustrative, where that continent is not self-sufficient and won't be with business as usual approaches. So a little bit about options for powering agriculture and just a look at sub-Saharan Africa, again, as a case study, but it is exemplative of much of what we see in developing countries. So the vast majority of the farming is smallholder. That's defined as 10 hectares is less, but that also is got a very interesting integration with each country that we'll talk about, because not only is it a huge source of GDP, but on average, most of the population is actually employed in this sector. So we've got these sort of twin effects of, it being incredibly crucial to the future of human development and to gross domestic product being improved, as well as this effect on jobs. But yet there's not equal access to the means of increasing productivity. So Power for All did a look at agricultural transformation plans. Over the last few decades, we've seen almost all countries on the continent come up with agricultural transformation plans. How do you create more productive outcomes so that people are actually able to meet their needs? But in fact, what we found is that only 60% include mention of energy access, despite what we know about the needs to use energy to increase productivity. Only 35% include decentralized renewables, and even less include a mention of productive use. So, and importantly, I think it's worth noting that only 1 in 37 of these agricultural transformation plans includes a specific pathway with targets, people who are supposed to own outcomes to actually increase productivity on the continent. So just a few more notes, and then I'll hand it over to colleagues to talk about what is possible by bringing renewable energy into food systems. You see from this graphic here that it is possible to stimulate growth, but also address the climate impacts by simply focusing on changing our forms of fuels. Amongst the things we'll be talking about, and some of the things that are identified in these transformation plans, are changing how we produce with, say, for example, solar-powered water and irrigation, post-harvest storage, transport, and processing. These are all things we'll hear about in just a minute. And just a preview to some of the discussions to be had around policy, really looking at some of the things that are in the way for adopting a broader use of renewables. And that includes this siloed thinking that I was mentioning at the beginning, a lack of collaboration, and I think one of the most important factors being access to end user finance. So with that, thank you so much for hearing those sort of opening remarks to begin our conversation. This was really meant to be a dialogue. This was just a thought starter. So those slides really weren't necessary. So I'll turn it back to our moderator, Ava.
Thank you very much for that, Christina. I'll start the discussion with the first question to Michela. From FAO standpoint, what is the perceived impact of climate change on agricultural productivity? And how crucial is it to address this issue?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Christina, for the very good overview, because of course it gives a lot of stimulus to the discussion. Of course, agriculture, energy and climate are strictly interlinked. So we know that agriculture needs energy at every step of the value chain. But at the same time, the agricultural systems emits GHG, greenhouse gases, which impacts negatively on climate change. And then climate change impacts negatively on agriculture. So it means that it's a circle that needs to be stopped. I mean, somehow with positive approaches. And we know that agriculture could be part of the solution with a transformative change. Just a few numbers, just to give you also an additional bits and pieces regarding the context. So by 2050, we are expecting the global population to grow up to 10 billion people, which means more food, more water, more energy needed for this increased population. What does it mean? It means that a transformative change of the agri-food systems is needed, and a sustainable energy is really a key component of this transformation change. Absolutely. A few numbers just to give you an idea of how important is the transformation of agri-food systems for the whole energy component and climate change component. 30% of the whole energy produced all over the world is used for agricultural processes, for agri-food systems. 33% of GHG emissions are due to the energy which is produced, which is used throughout the agricultural value chains, which means, once again, that the transformation of sustainable energy used throughout the agricultural value chains is very, very important. And in light of this, it's also important to highlight that an important piece of work where we could intervene in order to reduce, for example, food loss and waste is thanks to the energy, sustainable energy, green energy solutions used throughout the agricultural value chain. We will talk about this a little bit later, as soon as we will go into the details of various energy approaches that we could use. But just to finalize my initial thoughts, FAO is strongly committed and is working restless to work on energy smart agri-food systems approach, which means that we are supporting countries and relevant stakeholders in order to access sustainable energy throughout the agricultural value chains, supporting also national and regional strategies to respond to SDGs, NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And we deal with energy at every stage of the agri-food systems, which means energy which is needed for agriculture at every step of the agricultural value chain, but also energy that comes from agriculture, which means bioenergy, so biomass for energy purposes. And of course, without forgetting also the efficiency throughout the entire value chain. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michela. My next question goes to Ute. In 2021, IRENA and FAO published a report on the role of renewable energy in agri-food systems. What is the current status of energy use for agriculture, and how prevalent is the use of fossil fuels for farming and agro-processing and what is its impact?
Thank you, Eva. And yes, thanks for mentioning this report we did jointly with FAO, which I encourage you all to look at on both our websites. It's a very good resource, which has a lot of information. Now, Michela already mentioned the figure of 30%. It's actually a surprisingly high number of energy use through agri-food systems. It's worth recognizing that is really the whole chain. And in fact, I mean, I just want to focus in on two aspects of that. So on the one hand, we have in the developed world, a very energy intensive agriculture, you know, anything from using lots of farm machinery to horticulture, say in the more northern parts of Europe, for example, which is often very energy intensive in greenhouses, whereas in places like the UAE, where I'm normally based, we actually cool our greenhouses rather than heat them. So there's that energy intensive side of things, which is all basically mostly fossil fuel dominated. And then at the other end of the agri-food chain, we have the cooking problem, which is of course very prevalent in the developing world still, with 2.3 billion people without access to clean cooking. But it also means they use very energy inefficient stove, and it has various implications in terms of health problems and of course deforestation. So we have on the one hand the developed world, which has the fossil fuel impact and hence the greenhouse gas emissions. And then in the developing world, we have more of an issue of lack. On the one hand, yes, the very inefficient energy use on the cooking side of things, and then the rest of the value chain, a very low contribution of energy. So we've, for example, seen in, I mean, it's always hard to get these figures, so we've only got figures up to 2018. Between 2000 and 2018, so for this mostly 20-year period, we've had a 20% increase globally in energy use in agriculture, but that's mostly been in Asia, in the emerging economies. And of course, as we've already heard, Africa is just totally being left behind. 15% of the global population, but only 5% of the on-farm energy use, so a long way to go. So we've tried to highlight that at IRENA. We're working on all these aspects. And it's interesting though, I was in the earlier session on financing food system transformation, and I hear many of the same issues as we hear actually on renewable energy more broadly for developing countries and especially Africa, where it's just very challenging, and we need, everyone says we need a new model, so we can maybe come back to that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Christina, how do you think that governments and international organizations and also the private sector can collaborate and come together to try and increase and promote the use of pure technologies?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I mean, let me just start with the reality that there's no one silver bullet. There's no one product, person, policy that's going to transform agriculture, right? It takes a whole ecosystem of support. And so when you ask those questions, I mean, there's actually roles for everyone to play as we look at transforming agriculture with renewable energy, again, with this hope that we can all avoid a climate catastrophe while still meeting the increasing needs for food. For sure, I'd love to cite examples of some work that we're doing with partners in various countries, Uganda and Ethiopia. I would say that it is a very clear step in the right direction. Uganda was the one country that called out in its most recent revision of its agricultural transformation plan that there not only should be a focus on energy, renewable energy, but productive use of that renewable energy, and actually assigned people who were responsible for that as a bit of a KPI. So I think we've seen over the course of Power for All's role in the world that the more that there are targets and targets with specific owners to achieve those changes, it makes a difference. So that's one thing. I think it's also a really interesting time. And I mean, between what's happened in Nigeria in the last few weeks with changes in fuel prices, but then, you know, we hear a lot about fossil fuels, but there was a very dramatic effect on the economy with this removal of subsidies. But you do hear people in our space talk a lot about removal of subsidies and, or challenging these opportunities with what's happened with Ukraine and the availability and quality of fuel for farmers. For example, our partners in Ethiopia, the Ministry of Irrigation and Lowlands, the minister has decided to ban the sale of diesel pumps in the future for water and irrigation, which is a very bold move. And it's also an important time then when we have effects like that, where policy comes in, that the market is able to support, to come in and make sure that there's quality products available, that there's consumer awareness, et cetera. But NGOs to that effect also have a very important role to play in terms of driving awareness and really helping to legitimize these kinds of products and services. As a journalist, you'll understand the importance of public awareness. And I think, one of the things that we've encountered in the countries we've worked in is that there's still sort of it's still a very nascent market in many ways and not a huge recognition of these products and services. So there's a whole range of tactics that have been proven to work over time, whether it's a share fair, so bringing products and services, working with farmers cooperatives to raise awareness, et cetera. But we cannot, I think, overstate the importance of the role of an important policy signal that comes from governments who are willing to see that far ahead and take a stand.
Thank you for that. I think Michaela wanted to make some comments.
Yeah, more than comments, I wanted to give some numbers, because to also give the importance of the size of what energy smart agri-food systems could imply, also in terms of practical, concrete examples, and how policy interventions and public awareness, how much is really important. I would like to give some numbers just to give you an idea of sizes that we are talking about. So, for example, if we talk about solar irrigation, so it means solar panel systems used for irrigation pumps in agricultural practices. From our studies and in the context of the report that we developed in 2021 with IRENA, we ended up knowing that, for example, in India, the use of solar irrigation, where feasible, of course, where needed and feasible, would imply an increase of farmers' income by 50%. It's a lot. In Rwanda, it would imply an increase of farmers' yields by 1/3, which is also a lot. In terms of emissions, so emissions from solar irrigation with respect to use of irrigation using electricity grid or diesel, it would mean a reduced emissions by 95–98% with respect to normal diesel or electricity grids, which is enormous as an amount, as a number. Still, with reference to cold storage that I was mentioning before, so the importance of cold chain, the importance of cold storage and refrigeration systems, in particular in developing countries where a lot of food is lost, in the so-called first kilometer distance from the farm gate. So it means that we need to intervene. And in this case, 37% of food produced is lost in the first mile, so immediately after the farm gate, and this is happening in sub-Saharan Africa. So 37% of food lost after the first mile, within the first mile in sub-Saharan Africa. Another number, last one, but I believe that these numbers are really giving the size of how important this sector is. In Kenya, if we are able to use cold storage and refrigeration throughout the value chain, the agri-food value chain, this would reduce, of course, food loss and would increase the income of farmers by 30%. So big numbers that would be feasible if an appropriate energy smart agri-food system is in place. So this is to give an idea of how important is this discussion in concrete terms. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think those numbers were really useful in making it clear how big the impact can actually be. But then, Michaela, both to you and to Ute, so just to make it clear, what kind of technologies are available that could actually have an impact in this context?
Okay, shall I start? Yes, so we've already heard about solar irrigation. I mean, as we know, climate change, we already heard that, I think, from the Vice President or Prime Minister from Niger earlier on. You know, climate change is having a real impact on agricultural production. Countries which used to rely on rain now find they can't produce much. And of course, they do not have easy access to diesel, which generally has to be imported. So it can be a game changer, although I would like to raise a bit of caution as well. You know, we need to combine solar irrigation with a much more sustainable water management as well. Just on my way here yesterday from southern France, which has been suffering from a drought for some time, you know, again, I couldn't help noticing here are the farmers. I mean, it's not even solar irrigation, just irrigation, middle of the day, you know, not efficient types of irrigation, but those huge sprinklers. Most of that water will be wasted. So we need that approach and we know how to do it. There are many, many examples. So let's not get carried away with thinking solar irrigation on its own is going to be the panacea, because otherwise we're going to end up basically exhausting groundwater reservoirs, which would not be great. But then also let me just mention a few other things. I think biogas is a really good example as well, which can help across the food chain. So we have a lot of agricultural waste, especially, I mean, where people have livestock farming. So that waste, and at the same time, they're cooking with firewood or charcoal. Well, of course, you can very easily turn that animal waste into biogas, which you then use for cooking. And even better, you then have a byproduct, a digestate, which can be used as fertilizer when in so many developed countries, people don't have access to fertilizers. Then, of course, we have many other examples across the chain. If you want to add a few more, Michaela.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And indeed, someone of those I already mentioned that's the case of the cold, of the importance of the sustainable food cold chain. So refrigeration, which is becoming more and more relevant in all sectors, agricultural sector, but is becoming more and more relevant in the fisheries sector, in particular for countries that are coastal countries, of course, in developed and developing countries. We were mentioning this ourselves as I'm Italian, and so I'm from a country which is very much focused on fisheries together with agriculture as a background. And I would like to echo what Ute mentioned in terms of sustainable bioenergy. There are various forms of bioenergy that has the potential to impact very positively on various aspects like income or green jobs or gender involvement in the value chains. And it's important also to look at sustainable bioenergy at 360 degrees. So bioenergy for transportation, bioenergy for heat and electricity. And actually, bioenergy is one of the most important energy sources that are very flexible, that could be used for various kinds of application with respect to other renewable energy sources. And another example that I would like to add, in addition to the biogas that was mentioned by Ute, is also the use of micro gasification systems that not only allow heat and access to electricity, let's say, but also the possibility to take out a byproduct, which is biochar, which is then used here again as the digestate into the soil as an organic fertilizer. So very, very good in terms of green cycle of bioeconomy, which is an additional added value. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one thing there too, which is, I started off my remarks talking about how there's this overlap between the countries that don't have a great deal of energy access in their countries, and also those that could really improve productivity with use of renewables. So we did a mapping exercise that was actually, it made a cameo appearance in the FAO and IRENA report that looked at where microgrids would be most viable. And there's a really perfect overlap with some of the most important crops in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's great about that is that mini grids themselves, right, which are a great tool to delivering energy access to many of the unconnected, they need an anchor load to be successful. It's often been shown that just simply connecting to houses and doing individual consumers can cause some challenges for the way a mini grid operates, ranging from uptime, et cetera. But by having an anchor load with, say, what would be considered an industrial, say, dryer or miller that's powered by solar power would be a great solution for a community that's agricultural. So there's really in so many ways such an incredible dovetailing of opportunity to both deliver energy and deliver more productivity. Again, for this impending crisis, I think all of us are seeing if we don't adapt, which is, trying to meet the food needs with agriculture done in the way that there's no better way to call it besides business as usual, which is highly dependent on fossil fuels.
Well, thank you for that. I have a question a bit to all of you. Christina, you touched upon it before, because I'd like to speak a bit about the role of policymakers. And so what can they do? What should they do? How much courage does it take? And do you see that courage today? I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Christina or?
Yeah, I can hop in. I think courage comes after awareness, and we have to do a lot as a sector, the decentralized renewable sector, the productive use sector. Those of us who are trying to drive adoption of renewables, it's up to us to really be at events like this stock take and make sure that not just the three of us, but the people we know and others are having a regular conversation about the importance of renewables. And in fact, how we all got to be friends over this issue a few years ago is the original UN Food System Summit 2 years ago, just on the heels of COVID. I was a champion in the UN system, which is a kind of funny designation, but it's real. It comes with a idea of a cape and all of that. But part of what we were advocating for at the last UN Food System Summit was making sure that how we power the food system was discussed. And we started out being the only ones in the room, and obviously we being the three of us. But what's great is that voice is now beginning to be echoed. And so once we have that awareness and we have the data, like this incredible report from FAO and IRENA, we can start putting these options in front of policymakers and then put in front of them further, how do you do it? So not just pointing fingers, but pointing towards solutions. So that in this case can include making it easier for these companies to do business, making it easier to import, getting rid of things like VAT on solar products, et cetera. So sure, it takes some courage and bravery, but we got your back.
I mean, obviously, one thing that's an issue at the national level is, policymakers. Well, I think every government has an agriculture, food, whatever ministry, and then a separate energy, maybe industry, whatever ministry. And I wouldn't say these people probably don't have much interaction. And we see this, so we're an international organization. FAO is an international organization. Well, of course, the government reps who are here today, I wouldn't recognize any of them because they're different to the government reps IRENA gets at its meetings. But I think, for example, we've joined up with the UAE as it's hosting COP28, and we've started this Lives and Livelihoods initiative, which is all about greater resilience, adaptation to climate change, specifically on agri-food and health. So within that, we're trying to raise funding, which is also necessary, but it also means that, you know, our governments, if they want to benefit from this, then they'll of course have to also link up with their agricultural colleagues. So that kind of thing is at least helpful. One thing I want to also throw in, which, and I'm sure my colleagues here have stuff to say on this as well, as we are an all-female panel, you know, women still struggle in this whole ecosystem, struggle to get access, struggle to get recognized, and yet it's women who often can make things work in the agricultural value chain, whether it's from working in the fields and making their life easier through some level of mechanization to the whole food chain. And yet women often get excluded in thinking what is needed. So that's what we need policymakers to really think about. How can we make this an inclusive approach? And there's so much potential for employment for women, for youth as well. So
30 seconds.
Yes. So very quickly, 2 points. The first one is it's important to look at diversification of energy sources. So if we could do a little bit of everything depending on the context, that would be the best. It's the most important thing is that it has to be context specific. The second point, it's important to collect data, and also the president of IFAD mentioned in the plenary, we need data to take informed decision, not only for funding, which was the context of the discussion in the plenary earlier this morning, but also for policy decisions, so that policy decisions are taken with due background, informed decision. So feasibility studies that should be very context specific are extremely important to get the data that the policymaker needs in order to take appropriate decisions. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we won't have time for questions right now because we were a bit late in starting this. I think, though, the speakers will be available throughout these days if you have specific questions for them. Just to close, I think I'd like to thank you all, first of all, because also for me, this has been sort of enlightening as a journalist. I think what this topic is really sort of the missing link in a way in the entire agricultural climate change debate. And so I think it's really important, as you say, to highlight it and to create the awareness of it. Also because it seems to me when I hear you speaking that it also comes with a range of opportunities for improvement in lots of ways and in lots of places. So thank you for listening, and thank you again to all our speakers.
Thank you.